Dr. Sarah Thompson walked through the busy parking lot of Marshall Executive Airport, pulling her small black suitcase behind her. The morning was bright and clear, perfect for flying. She had done this trip many times before, flying between hospitals to help sick patients who needed her special skills as a brain surgeon. Sarah, as her friends called her, was wearing her favorite dark blue suit and comfortable black shoes. She always dressed professionally, especially when traveling. Her natural hair was styled neatly, and she wore the golden necklace her grandmother had given her for graduation. It was her lucky charm for important days like this. The time was 9:30 a.m., and Sarah was right on schedule. She had an important surgery to perform at Central Hospital in Chicago at 3:00 p.m. Many doctors had tried to help the patient, but they needed Sarah's special skills. She was one of the best brain surgeons in the country, and hospitals often called her for difficult cases. As she walked toward the private terminal, Sarah noticed how different it was from the regular airport. Everything was quieter, cleaner, and more organized. The building was made of glass and steel, with large windows that showed the private jets parked outside. Palm trees lined the walkway, their leaves moving gently in the morning breeze. Sarah had her papers ready in her hand, her pilot-approved documents, medical license, and special airport security card. She had used them many times before at different airports. Being organized was part of who she was, both as a doctor and a traveler. A group of business people walked past her, laughing and talking about their meetings. They nodded politely to her, just like they did to everyone else. This was normal at the private terminal, where most people were either business leaders or professionals like Sarah. The security desk was just ahead. Sarah could see 3 guards working there, checking papers and helping other passengers. She had gone through this process hundreds of times at different airports. Usually, it was quick and simple. Show your papers, answer a few questions, and walk through to your plane. Sarah checked her phone one last time. There was a message from the hospital in Chicago confirming they were ready for her arrival. She also saw a photo from her last patient, a young girl who could now play soccer again after Sarah had helped her. These messages always made Sarah smile and reminded her why she loved her job so much. Her pilot, Captain Rodriguez, had already sent her a text saying the plane was ready. He had flown her many times before and knew she was always on time. The flight would take 2 hours, giving her plenty of time to review her patient's files and prepare for the surgery. As she got closer to the security desk, Sarah adjusted her medical bag on her shoulder. It contained important tools and documents she would need for the surgery. The bag had gone through security at private airports all over the country, and she had all the proper permits for her medical equipment. The morning sun was now streaming through the large windows, making patterns on the shiny floor. Other passengers were walking around, some heading to their planes, others just arriving. The smell of fresh coffee came from the terminal's small cafe, mixing with the clean, air-conditioned air. Sarah checked her watch again, still perfect timing. She had planned everything carefully, as she always did. In her job, being exact and careful was very important. Every minute could make a difference in her work, whether she was in surgery or traveling to help a patient. She took a deep breath and walked toward the security desk, ready for what she thought would be a normal check-in process. Sarah had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would change not just her day, but would lead to important changes in how private airports treated all their passengers. James Miller stood at the security desk, his blue uniform pressed and neat. He had worked at Marshall Executive Airport for 6 months, but many people already knew him for being strict with the rules. Some said he was too strict, especially with certain passengers. Today, he was working at the main security checkpoint, watching everyone who came through the private terminal. When Dr. Sarah Thompson walked up to his desk, Miller didn't look up right away. He was busy checking his phone, even though this wasn't allowed during work hours. Sarah waited patiently, holding out her documents. After what felt like a long minute, Miller finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "This is the private terminal," he said loudly, making several nearby passengers turn their heads. "I think you might be lost. The main terminal is in the other building." His voice was sharp and unfriendly, very different from how he had spoken to the business people who had just passed through. Sarah kept her voice calm and steady. "I'm in the right place," she said, placing her documents on the counter. "I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson. I have a private flight scheduled to Chicago for an emergency surgery." She pointed to her medical bag and pilot-verified credentials. Miller barely glanced at the papers. Instead, he stood up straighter, trying to look more important. "These could be fake," he said, pushing the documents back toward her. "We get people trying to sneak in here all the time." His words were clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. A small crowd was starting to form. Other passengers stuck to watch, some looking uncomfortable, others pulling out their phones. 2 other security guards at nearby desks exchanged worried looks, but they didn't say anything. "Sir," Sarah said, still keeping her voice professional, "I've flown from this terminal many times. You can check your system. Dr. Sarah Thompson, neurosurgeon. My flight is scheduled for 10 a.m. with Captain Rodriguez." She pulled up her flight details on her phone as extra proof. Miller crossed his arms. "Anyone can make fake documents and pretend to be a doctor," he said. "I need to see extra ID. And what's in that medical bag? Could be anything in there." His voice got louder with each word, drawing even more attention. Sarah took out her hospital ID, her medical license, and her driver's license. She had dealt with difficult people before, but this was different. She could feel her heart beating faster, but she didn't let it show on her face. She had learned long ago that staying calm was the best way to handle unfair treatment. "My medical bag has been approved for air travel," she explained. "It contains surgical tools that I need for today's emergency operation. All the permits are right here." She pointed to the special permits attached to her flight documents. Miller picked up his radio, ignoring the additional IDs she had shown him. "Security check needed at main desk," he said into it. "Possible situation here." He emphasized the word situation while staring directly at Sarah. The crowd around them had grown larger. Some people were whispering to each other, shaking their heads. A few had their phones out, recording what was happening. One woman in a business suit was talking quietly but urgently into her phone. Sarah stood straight and tall, keeping her dignity even as Miller continued to question her. She noticed a young girl watching from nearby, holding her mother's hand. The girl looked confused and scared by what was happening. Sarah gave her a small, gentle smile, trying to show that sometimes you had to stay strong even when people weren't being fair. The morning sun that had felt so bright and promising earlier now felt hot and uncomfortable through the terminal's glass walls. Sarah's watch showed 9:45 a.m. Her flight was supposed to leave in 15 minutes. Someone in Chicago was waiting for her help, and this man was standing in her way for no good reason. Just then, Sarah heard familiar footsteps behind her. She turned slightly and saw Captain Rodriguez walking quickly toward the security desk. His face showed concern as he took in the scene in front of him. Help was coming, but the situation was far from over. Captain Rodriguez reached the security desk, his pilot's uniform neat and crisp. He had flown Dr. Thompson many times before and knew her as one of his most respected passengers. The look on his face showed he was not happy with what he was seeing. "Is there a problem here?" Captain Rodriguez asked, looking directly at Miller. "Dr. Thompson is my passenger. We have an emergency medical flight scheduled in." He checked his watch. 12 minutes. Miller didn't back down. Instead, he seemed to get more upset that someone was questioning him. "I'm doing my job," he said sharply. "We need to be extra careful about security these days. How do you know these papers are real?" Sarah stood quietly, watching as more people gathered around them. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably the hospital in Chicago wondering where she was. But she couldn't check it now. She needed to stay focused on handling this situation. "I've flown Dr. Thompson more than 20 times, Captain Rodriguez said. "She's one of the top brain surgeons in the country. There's a patient waiting for her in Chicago." His voice was firm but professional. Miller shook his head. "That doesn't prove anything. She could have fooled you too." He turned to Sarah again. "If you're really a doctor, why don't you have an escort? Important people usually have someone with them." Several people in the crowd gasped at his words. A businessman who had passed through security earlier stepped forward. "I never had an escort," he said. "You didn't ask me for one. You barely looked at my ID." Miller's face turned red, but he wouldn't give up. "That's different," he mumbled, not looking at the businessman. Then he turned back to Sarah. "I need to search your medical bag. Could be anything in there." Sarah finally spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "Sir, these tools are sterile and prepared for emergency surgery. Opening the bag now would contaminate them. The permits for all items are listed right here. She pointed to the documents again. 2 more security guards arrived, responding to Miller's earlier radio call. They looked confused when they saw the scene. One of them, whose name tag read Wilson, recognized Sarah from her previous flights. "Dr. Thompson?" Officer Wilson said, surprised. "Is everything okay here?" "We know her," he told Miller. "She flies out for emergency surgeries all the time." But Miller wouldn't listen. "Rules are rules," he said, getting louder. "And I say something's not right here. I want to see inside that bag, and I want to call the hospital to check if they're really expecting a doctor." Sarah's phone buzzed again. She knew time was running out. Her patient in Chicago couldn't wait much longer. She looked at Captain Rodriguez, who was already pulling out his phone to call the airport management. The crowd had grown even bigger. Some people were recording everything on their phones. Others were talking angrily about how unfair this was. A few were on their phones, probably calling the airport to complain. Through it all, Sarah kept her calm. She had faced unfair treatment before, but she never let it make her act unprofessional. She thought about her patient waiting in Chicago, using that to help her stay strong. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice still steady, "I understand you're trying to do your job, but right now, you're preventing an emergency medical flight from taking off. Someone's life depends on this surgery. Would you like to explain to the hospital why their patient couldn't get help in time?" The terminal had gone very quiet. Everyone was watching to see what would happen next. Even the coffee shop workers had stopped what they were doing to watch. The morning sun now fell across the security desk, lighting up all the documents that proved Sarah was exactly who she said she was. Just then, the main door opened. Airport management was walking in quickly, led by a woman in a business suit who looked very concerned. The situation was about to change, but the tension in the air was still thick enough to feel. Mrs. Diana Chen, the airport operations manager, walked quickly toward the security desk. She had been running the private terminal for 15 years, and she could tell from across the room that something was very wrong. Behind her were 2 senior security officers and the airport's customer service manager. The crowd parted to let them through. Mrs. Chen took one look at Dr. Thompson standing calmly at the desk, then at Miller's angry face, and knew exactly what was happening. She had seen this kind of unfair treatment before, but never at her airport. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice firm and clear. Before Miller could speak, she noticed the time on the wall clock. "Dr. Thompson, isn't your medical flight supposed to leave in 5 minutes?" Sarah nodded politely. "Yes, Mrs. Chen, I've been trying to explain to Mr. Miller that I have an emergency surgery scheduled in Chicago. All my papers are in order." She gestured to the documents still spread out on the security desk. Mrs. Chen picked up the papers and looked through them quickly. Her face grew more serious with each page she read. Everything was perfect: pilot verification, medical credentials, security clearances, and equipment permits. All approved and organized, just as she would expect from Dr. Thompson. "Mr. Miller," Mrs. Chen said, turning to face him, "please explain why you're holding up an emergency medical flight when all documentation is clearly in order." Her voice was calm but had a sharp edge to it. Miller started to look nervous for the first time. I was just being thorough," he stammered. "You can't be too careful these days, and she doesn't look like our usual private jet passengers." The crowd muttered angrily at his words. Mrs. Chen's face turned stern. "And what exactly do our usual passengers look like, Mr. Miller?" she asked. The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward again. "We're now 7 minutes behind schedule," he reported. "The hospital in Chicago has called twice. They need Dr. Thompson in their operating room by 3:00 p.m. Mrs. Chen turned to the 2 senior security officers behind her. "Please escort Mr. Miller to the office," she said firmly. "We'll discuss this incident in detail later." Then she looked at Officer Wilson. "Please help Dr. Thompson through security immediately." As Miller was led away, his face red with embarrassment, Mrs. Chen turned to Sarah. "Dr. Thompson, I cannot apologize enough for this incident," she said sincerely. "This is not what our airport stands for. Please, let us expedite your security check so you can make your flight." Officer Wilson quickly but professionally checked Sarah's credentials and medical bag. The whole process took less than 2 minutes. exactly how long it should have taken in the first place. Other passengers watched, some nodding in approval at how things were finally being handled correctly. The customer service manager stepped forward with a tablet. Dr. Thompson, if you're willing, we'd like to take your statement about this incident later. We're launching a full investigation. Sarah agreed to talk to them when she returned from Chicago. As Officer Wilson finished the security check, the crowd began to clap. Not loud or dramatic clapping, but quiet, respectful applause for how Sarah had handled the whole situation with such dignity. The young girl who had been watching earlier smiled at Sarah, and Sarah smiled back. Mrs. Chen personally walked with Sarah and Captain Rodriguez toward the private jet area. We'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again, she promised. Your work is too important to be delayed by such behavior. Sarah checked her phone as they walked. The hospital in Chicago had sent 3 messages. She quickly texted back that she was on her way. Despite the delay, she would still make it in time for the surgery. Her patient would get the help they needed. As they reached the door to the tarmac, Mrs. Chen turned to Sarah one last time. Thank you for your grace under pressure, Dr. Thompson. You showed everyone here today what true professionalism looks like. The private jet waited on the tarmac, its engines already running. Sarah walked across the smooth concrete with Mrs. Chen and Captain Rodriguez, her medical bag secure in her hand. The morning sun felt warm again, and the fresh air helped clear her mind of the unpleasant experience inside. 2 ground crew members stood ready at the jet's stairs. They had been waiting anxiously, knowing about the delay inside the terminal. Both smiled respectfully at Sarah as she approached. One of them, wearing a yellow safety vest, quickly but carefully took her bag to store it safely on the plane. Dr. Thompson, Captain Rodriguez said as they reached the stairs, we can make up some time in the air. I've already radioed ahead for priority landing clearance in Chicago. He checked his watch. We'll have you there with enough time to prepare for surgery. Inside the terminal, people were still watching through the large windows. Many had their phones out, recording the moment. Some were typing quickly on their phones, probably sharing what they had seen on social media. The story of what happened was already spreading. Mrs. Chen stood at the bottom of the stairs. When you return from Chicago, Dr. Thompson, you'll see some changes here, she promised. We're starting a complete review of our security procedures today. Her voice was firm and determined. Sarah turned to Mrs. Chen before climbing the stairs. Thank you for your quick response, she said quietly. But please remember, this isn't just about me. It's about making sure everyone is treated with respect. Several people standing near the windows nodded in agreement. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed again. It was a message from the Chicago hospital. Operating room being prepared. Patient's family sending their thanks for coming. This reminder of why she was traveling helped push the morning's trouble further from her mind. The inside of the jet was cool and quiet. Sarah settled into her usual seat, pulling out her patient's files. She had work to focus on now. In a few hours, she would be doing what she did best, helping someone who needed her medical skills. Captain Rodriguez completed his final checks quickly. Weather is clear all the way to Chicago, he told Sarah. It should be a smooth flight. His co-pilot gave a thumbs up, indicating everything was ready. As the jet's door closed, Sarah could see Mrs. Chen walking back to the terminal. 2 senior security officers were waiting to talk to her. Through the windows, Sarah noticed that Miller's desk was now empty, and Officer Wilson was handling security checks smoothly and professionally. The plane started to move, turning toward the runway. Sarah looked out her window one last time and saw something unexpected. The young girl who had watched everything in the terminal was pressing her hand against the window, waving goodbye. Next to her, her mother was smiling proudly at Sarah. Sarah waved back, remembering how she had once been a young girl dreaming of becoming a doctor. She had faced many challenges along the way, but she never let them stop her. Today was just another reminder that staying professional and strong was always the right choice. The jet engines grew louder as they reached the runway. Sarah opened her patient's file, reading through the medical details one more time. She had already reviewed them carefully, but she always checked everything again before surgery. Behind them, the airport was getting smaller. Below, the city spread out like a map, with cars looking like tiny dots moving along the streets. The troubles of the morning were falling away with each foot they climbed into the clear blue sky. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the speaker. Dr. Thompson, We're on our way to Chicago. Expected arrival time is 2:15 p.m. Please let us know if you need anything." The plane leveled off smoothly, heading toward their destination. Sarah smiled slightly as she continued reading her medical files. She knew that while she was in the air, changes were already starting at Marshall Executive Airport. Sometimes, one person standing strong could help make things better for everyone who would come after. While Dr. Thompson was flying to Chicago, the story of what happened at Marshall Executive Airport was spreading quickly across the internet. People who had witnessed the incident were sharing their videos and stories online. By noon, the airport's phone lines were ringing constantly. Lisa Martinez, one of the passengers who had recorded the incident, posted her video with the message, "Just witnessed an incredible doctor face discrimination at the private terminal. She stayed so professional even when the guard was being completely unfair." The video started getting thousands of views within the first hour. In the airport's main office, Mrs. Chen was having an emergency meeting with her staff. The room was full of concerned faces as they watched more and more people sharing the story online. News reporters were already calling, asking for information about what had happened. "We need to do better," Mrs. Chen told her team. "This incident shows us where we need to improve." She looked around the room at her staff. "Dr. Thompson showed us what real dignity looks like. Now we need to show everyone that we learned from this." The young girl who had watched everything, whose name was Jenny, was sitting with her mother in the airport cafe. "Mom," she said, still thinking about what she had seen, "I want to be brave like Dr. Thompson when I grow up." Her mother smiled proudly, glad that her daughter had seen such a strong example. By early afternoon, the story had reached major news websites. Headlines read, "Renowned surgeon faces discrimination at private airport," and "Doctor's professional response to airport bias goes viral." People were sharing their own similar experiences in the comments, starting important conversations about treating everyone fairly. The airport's customer service team was working hard to respond to all the messages they were getting. Many people were writing to support Dr. Thompson and asking what changes the airport would make. Others were sharing the story to help prevent similar incidents at other airports. Officer Wilson, who had helped Dr. Thompson through security after Mrs. Chen arrived, was interviewed by the airport's investigation team. "I've checked Dr. Thompson's credentials many times before," he explained. "She's always been professional and organized. What happened today was completely wrong." Back in the main terminal, regular passengers who had heard about the incident were talking about it while waiting for their flights. Many were reading news articles on their phones or watching the viral videos. The story was making people think about how they could help stop unfair treatment when they saw it. The business travelers who had witnessed the incident were also spreading the word. Many of them flew regularly and had connections at other airports. They were sending messages to their contacts, sharing what they had seen and asking for better training at all airports. By mid-afternoon, Mrs. Chen had written an official statement from the airport. It was clear and honest. "We apologize for the discriminatory treatment Dr. Thompson faced. We are making immediate changes to prevent this from happening again. We thank Dr. Thompson for her grace and professionalism during this incident." The airport's social media team carefully posted the statement online. Within minutes, thousands of people had shared it. Comments were pouring in from all over the country, most of them supporting Dr. Thompson and praising the airport for taking quick action to fix the problem. Local community leaders started calling the airport, offering to help with new training programs. They wanted to work together to make sure all travelers were treated with respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Throughout the afternoon, more videos from different angles appeared online. Each one showed the same thing: Dr. Thompson staying calm and professional while facing unfair treatment. People were calling her an inspiration and a role model. The story was becoming more than just one incident at one airport. It was starting conversations about making real changes in how people treat each other. Mrs. Chen looked at all the messages coming in and knew that tomorrow would bring even more attention to what had happened. 1 week after the incident, Marshall Executive Airport looked different. New signs hung in the terminal showing clear rules for security checks. Every security desk had a tablet with easy-to-follow guidelines. The biggest change, though, wasn't something people could see. It was in how the staff worked. Mrs. Chen had kept her promise to Dr. Thompson. The airport had started a new training program for all workers. They brought in experts to teach about treating everyone fairly and with respect. Even experienced staff members like Officer Wilson joined the training, wanting to learn more about how to do their jobs better. The security desk where Miller had worked now had a new guard named Officer Sarah Martinez. She was friendly and professional with everyone who came through. She had pictures of her own family on her desk, people from different backgrounds who had taught her the importance of treating everyone with respect. Dr. Thompson's story had become part of the training materials. New workers watched the videos and learned how to handle difficult situations properly. They studied how Dr. Thompson stayed professional even when faced with unfair treatment. Her example was helping create better security officers. The young girl Jenny, who had watched everything that day, came back to the airport with her mother. They were flying to visit family, and Jenny noticed all the changes. "Mom, look," she said excitedly, pointing to a new poster that showed people of all backgrounds being welcomed at the airport. Mrs. Chen had also started a monthly meeting where travelers could share their experiences and suggest improvements. Many people came to the first meeting, including some who had witnessed what happened to Dr. Thompson. They wanted to help make the airport better for everyone. The airport's new rules were simple and clear. Check everyone's papers the same way, use professional language with all passengers, and never make assumptions about who belonged where. If security guards had questions, they had to talk to their supervisors politely and professionally. Other airports started calling Marshall Executive, wanting to learn about their new training program. Mrs. Chen shared everything they had learned. "What happened here could happen anywhere," she told them, "but we can all work together to stop it." The business travelers who had seen the incident spread the word about the positive changes. Some of them wrote letters to their own local airports, asking them to follow Marshall Executive's example. The story was helping create changes far beyond one airport. Officer Wilson, who had helped Dr. Thompson that day, became one of the trainers for new security staff. He taught them about checking credentials properly and treating everyone with respect. "We keep people safe by being professional with everyone," he would say during training sessions. The airport's customer service team created a new system for handling complaints. Any traveler who felt they were treated unfairly could report it immediately. Mrs. Chen personally reviewed these reports every day to make sure problems were fixed quickly. Local schools started asking if they could bring students to see how the airport worked. They wanted young people to learn about treating everyone fairly. Mrs. Chen always said yes, happy to show how one difficult moment had led to positive changes. The airport's walls now had pictures showing all kinds of travelers, business people, doctors, pilots, and families from different backgrounds. Under each picture was the same message: "Welcome to Marshall Executive Airport, where everyone flies with respect." Dr. Thompson's regular flights continued through the airport. Each time she came through security, the process was smooth and professional, just as it should be. Other passengers often recognized her from the viral videos, but she remained humble, focusing on her important work. The incident had changed more than just rules and procedures. It changed how people thought about treating each other. The airport workers learned that real security meant making everyone feel safe and respected, no matter who they were or what they looked like. As Mrs. Chen often said in her meetings, sometimes it takes one moment to show us where we need to improve, but it takes everyone working together to make real change happen. The story of what happened that day continued to help make air travel better for everyone. 6 months had passed since the incident at Marshall Executive Airport. On a bright morning, much like the day everything happened, Dr. Sarah Thompson walked through the same terminal doors. This time, things were very different. The security area had been completely redesigned. Instead of one main desk, there were 3 professional check-in points. Each had clear signs showing what documents were needed. The security guards smiled and worked quickly, treating every passenger with the same respect. Officer Martinez, who now ran the security team, greeted Dr. Thompson warmly. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson. Chicago again today?" she asked, efficiently checking the doctor's credentials. The whole process took less than 2 minutes, exactly how it should be. The young girl Jenny, who had watched everything that day, was now taking a special interest in medicine at school. Her class had done a project about people who made a difference in their community, and she had written about Dr. Thompson. Her teacher had shared the story with other classes. Mrs. Chen's new training program had become famous in the airport industry. 20 other airports across the country had started using it. They called it the Thompson Protocol. a set of rules and guidelines that helped make sure everyone was treated fairly when traveling. The terminal walls now showed pictures of different moments in the airport's history. Among them was a photo from that important day, showing Dr. Thompson standing tall and professional. Under it was a simple message: dignity and respect make us stronger. Dr. Thompson's patient from Chicago, the one she had operated on that difficult day, was doing well. The patient had written a thank you letter to the airport, saying how grateful they were that Dr. Thompson had made it to the surgery despite the delays. The letter hung in Mrs. Chen's office. The airport's new policies had helped many other travelers. Business people from different backgrounds reported feeling more welcome. Medical professionals carrying emergency supplies got through security smoothly. Everyone noticed how much better things worked when people were treated fairly. Jenny and her mother now flew regularly from the airport. Jenny always pointed out the changes to her friends. See how they check everyone the same way? That's because of Dr. Thompson. She dreamed of becoming a doctor herself one day. The airport staff had learned important lessons. Officer Wilson, who still helped train new security guards, always told them, "Remember, we're not just checking papers. We're showing people that everyone deserves respect." Dr. Thompson kept busy with her important work, flying to different hospitals to help patients. She didn't talk much about what had happened that day. Instead, she let her actions speak for her, staying professional and kind no matter where she went. Some of the passengers who had recorded videos that day stayed in touch with the airport. They came to special meetings where people talked about making air travel better for everyone. Their videos were now used in training programs at airports around the country. The airport's reputation had grown stronger. More people chose to fly from Marshall Executive because they knew they would be treated fairly. Other airports sent their staff to learn from Mrs. Chen and her team about how to serve all passengers better. Little things showed how much had changed. The coffee shop in the terminal now had magazines and books about people from all backgrounds who had made history in aviation. The waiting areas had comfortable seats for everyone, and signs in multiple languages welcomed all travelers. Dr. Thompson's example had inspired others to speak up when they saw unfair treatment. People remembered how she had stayed calm and professional, showing that one person's dignity could help change things for everyone. 6 months later, as Dr. Thompson's plane took off for another emergency surgery, she looked down at the airport through her window. The changes below were easy to see: more staff, better facilities, happier travelers. But the biggest change was in how people treated each other, and that would last for years to come.